Brian Yennis with us now is the former U.S. Attorney General Bill Barr, what he makes of all of it. Mr. Attorney General, very good to have you.
Good to see you, Neil.
Let me ask you first off about what this case comes down to, that Donald Trump has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution, but only for official acts. Is it going to be up to a lower court then to determine the difference?
That's right. I think this was a very sensible decision that I think most lawyers familiar with this area expected, which is this went up to the court in a very abstract posture, which was the government's very broad assertion there was no immunity whatsoever. What the court's saying here is no, there's absolute immunity when he's acting directly under the Constitution, carrying out a function under the Constitution. There is presumptive immunity when he performs an official act, and the government has the burden of showing that it can prosecute him for that without impairing the executive function. And finally, there's no immunity for unofficial or private acts. And I think the practical effect of this is that the district court is going to do what it really should have done at the beginning, which the government really should have had it do, which is do the analysis so the facts are going up to the Supreme Court. So as a practical matter, there's not going to be a trial of this case before the election.
So I guess it comes back to that difference between official and private conduct. What's to stop a president, former or otherwise, from saying everything I do is an official act?
Well, because the test and the dissent by Justice Sotomayor, I think, unfairly portrays the majority opinion. The question is, what's the function being performed? What's the authority being used? Not what instrument is being used. So, for example, the president can direct that a case be dropped, and that's part of his constitutional authority. But he cannot accept a bribe to do that because that's receiving a bribe. He doesn't have authority to receive a bribe. Another example would be he has the right to go and tell the Department of Justice to investigate something. But an example used by Justice Sotomayor was, then he can fabricate evidence, give the evidence to the department and tell them to use that to indict them. He doesn't have authority to fabricate evidence. That's not carrying out an executive function. And the worst example, I think, the one that makes no sense whatsoever, is the idea that he can use SEAL Team 6 to kill a political opponent. The president has the authority to defend the country against foreign enemies, armed conflict, and so forth. He has the authority to direct the justice system against criminals at home. He doesn't have authority to go and assassinate people. So whether he uses the SEAL team or a private hitman, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make it a carrying out of his authority. So all these horror stories really are false.
Maybe so, but it's igniting fears on the left that it's going to empower him. One put it this way, that it could empower Donald Trump to wield executive power in more extreme ways in a second term. What do you think of that? That it will embolden him to do the very things that Democrats have been pounding?
Well, I would say what the Chief Justice said in the opinion, which is the Supreme Court has to write an opinion, a timeless opinion, an opinion that covers all situations in the future and that will be good for the country over the long haul. And they can't write opinions tailored to the particular exigencies of the moment. So that said, I think that there's ample teeth remaining because they have said that even official acts can be prosecuted if the government can show, under the circumstances, the particular facts of the case, that it would not impair the executive function.
Bill, let me answer something. I mean, when we chatted last time in the studio, you were talking about the fact when push comes to shove, you would support Donald Trump as the party's nominee, as indeed the party's nominee, with all the misgivings you had about what a second term might be like. I think he said it could breed a great deal of havoc. Having said that, some think that this might provide a green light for what some fear could be a Donald Trump vendetta campaign in a second term. He says success will be his best revenge, although he's intimated that he remembers what some have done to him. What do you think of that?
Well, first, I think those concerns are overblown about him seeking personal revenge against people. And second, I think that there are sufficient institutional checks and balances that's very difficult to do, and certainly difficult to do without it being detected. So, there are a lot of people in the government, a lot of career employees that have to be involved in any investigation and any presentation of a case to a grand jury and so forth. So the idea that he's going to be able to go out and weaponize, as they say, the Department of Justice against his adversaries, I don't think there's a particularly acute risk of that.
How do you think a second term would go? It's been a very good past 5-6 days for Donald Trump with the meltdown of the president and the debate, people still trying to figure out what happened there. And now these series of decisions that have gone his way, that he would be in a strong place, particularly emboldened if he does get elected with possibly a Republican Senate, maybe a Republican House. Already there are signs right now that the House is looking into a lot of this stuff against Democratic prosecutors who were going after him, that they would do his bidding. Do you think that's a fair shot that they will do his bidding?
What, that his appointees will?
That his appointees, and that we're already seeing it in a House that wants to go after some of the prosecutors who've been going against him. That they're weaponizing the House now, that they're weaponizing things already.
Yeah. Well, when I look at his first term, he had a very successful first term. He got a lot of things done against a lot of tremendous opposition. And, I hear a lot of rhetoric about him going after his enemies and so forth, but I don't see any specifics as to that happening during his first term. And I think, I don't minimize Trump's flaws and especially a lot of his rhetoric and the effect that can have on the body politic. But I think as I said, when I look at the two different choices, for me, it's an easy choice. That I think the threat to democracy and the threat to the United States and the most damage would be done by 4 more years of Biden versus Trump. And I think given the particular problems we face internationally, the problem of the administrative state, the problem of the sluggishness of our economy, the inflation and so forth, that he's the right person for that job as between the two, and we have to choose between those two individuals.
Indeed. Faced with that same choice, Attorney General Paul Bryan, the former Speaker of the House, he's now on the Fox Board of Directors. Anyway, he thinks that this is a bridge too far to cross for him, and that he could not support Donald Trump. I just want you to take a peek at this.
Bill is a good friend of mine.
Yeah.
I understand the binary argument. I just don't agree with it. It's just that simple.
Just that simple. So he can't support it. What do you say?
Well, I hear it, and I know some people who take that position, but what the binary argument means is he must feel that Biden is a better choice, and that Biden will do a better job over the next 4 years or do less damage to the United States over the next 4 years. I don't believe that. As I've said, I think it's not about me. It's not about me saying, oh, gee, I've kept my skirts clean and didn't vote for anybody or put a write-in or so forth. I feel if one of two people is going to end up with the office, then it's my duty as a voter to do what I can to support the person that I think would do the least damage.
Speaking of people with comments on Donald Trump, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went the other way, condemning the Supreme Court, saying that it has become consumed by a corruption crisis beyond its control, saying that today's ruling represents an assault on American democracy. It is up to Congress to defend our nation from this authoritarian capture. I intend on filing articles of impeachment upon our return. What do you make of that?
Well, I think this idea of going after I think these opinions were bang on. They were very reasonable opinions. I'm talking about the immunity opinion, the opinion on the Chevron doctrine, cutting that back. Also, the opinion on the obstruction statute and making sure that that's properly employed and isn't used as a dragnet. And I think that these were very reasonable opinions that put the law in the right place. And I'm afraid that this anything goes, let's do whatever we can to solve to address the political imperative at the moment. We're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're going to do long-term institutional damage to the United States. And I think the Supreme Court's doing just the opposite. I think they're protecting our institutions and the processes we have against being disfigured by the passions of the moment.
I think some of the concerns that were expressed don't extend just to Democrats. For example, Amy Coney Barrett, another Trump appointee, who went along with this decision, did express reservation about what they could or could not address, particularly that she felt that Donald Trump's so-called fake electors scheme was not protected from prosecution. What did you make of that? And that some of the nuances here that they couldn't get into, they didn't get into, and some are frustrated.
Well, I think she had one area where she disagreed with the majority.
Right.
And actually, the majority didn't say one way or the other whether the false electors effort or the talking to those electors was official or non-official. They left that up to the district court to address. What she was saying was, if there's something that's unofficial, an act that's unofficial, they should be able to introduce certain evidence about his intent behind other official acts, and that's a little bit down in the wires. It gets a little bit fine there, but that I think she makes a reasonable argument there. But she wasn't in the majority.
Now, a lot of these cases could get pushed back or dropped altogether. I understand that, but some have even said it applies to this hush money case and the weeding out of the penalty phase or the that's coming up on the 11th, that there are some matters in that means it could at least be broken apart or dropped altogether. For example, any conversations that Donald Trump had at the time with Hope Hicks, a key aide, and that would have to go, wouldn't be allowed, and then that case itself might go. What did you think of that?
Yeah, so generally, obviously, most of that stuff happened before he became president, but you're right. I mean, there are certain aspects of things that happened once he became president that were brought into that case. But that case is otherwise a mess. I mean, there's so much wrong with that case that's even more fundamental than that. That case is going to be reversed on appeal.
Okay. Let me just get your take. You mentioned finish it. I'm sorry, Bill. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, there's a fundamental denial of due process for the defense not to know what the crimes were that he supposedly committed.
That's the time we're going to learn about the sentencing there for that. And I'm just wondering, do you think Judge Marchand is going to put him in jail or make a statement, or is it too risky for him to do? What are his legal parameters here?
Well, the left has always surprised me during this thing at how far they're willing to go, but I would be shocked if he actually tried to put him in jail or sentence him to jail time, and certainly if he tried to put him in jail before his appeals. So I think they understand that that's a bridge too far to do that to a major party candidate right in the middle of the election.
If I can go back to this, and I appreciate your patience, but some things I just wanted to know and pick your brain on. And one was the issue of, Donald Trump will 78, just turned 78. He would be 82 leaving office. Some have cynically said, he will have full bore power. You dismiss that early on to go after his enemies. And again, he has stressed himself his best revenge will be success, take him at his word. But there are others who look at that and his age when he would be leaving office and that he wouldn't have to worry about punishment. It would be an afterthought to him. So he might be emboldened to do that, no matter what you say. What do you say?
Well, I would say, the president acts through people, and maybe he wouldn't worry about it, although I think he would. But the people that are around him and are being asked to do things, certainly I think they're going to make sure that they're behaving within the law, that they're behaving within the law. I understand people's concern, especially given his frequently incendiary rhetoric. I'm just saying, having experienced working with the person and being a subordinate of his, Bannon says I'm the first to go to prison under President Trump. I don't lose any sleep over it. I'm not worried about that.
I think he's in prison right now himself. Let me ask you, Bill Barr, finally, if you were I don't mean to make light of that. But if you were Attorney General coming in and Donald Trump was the newly elected president in a second term, and he's saying all these cases, I want them dropped. I want you to make them go away. What would you do?
I guess if I felt I wasn't able to drop them, I wouldn't accept the position.
You think that's part of the interview cycle that's going on now, that future AG possibilities he might consider if he's elected?
Yeah, so on the January 6th trial, I've said all along that I felt that was not a compelling case, and if I had been Attorney General, I don't think I would have brought it. And now it's sort of falling apart bit by bit. The obstruction statute that they use has been knocked out. Now you have the immunity issue. It's a very flimsy case, and I don't think it is a compelling case. I think there's a argument for dropping that case just on discretionary grounds. On the document case, I've said all along that I thought there was a strong basis for that case. On the other hand, you're in a situation now where they have refused to bring a case against Biden for having those documents, and now you have this disparate treatment. And so, you know, there's arguments just to sort of cool the political temperature here in the country, and this deep feeling that there are two standards about not moving forward with that case. So there are plausible arguments to make for the exercise of the AG's discretion not to pursue those cases. But I think the president, at the end of the day, does have authority to say drop those cases.
And if one attorney general won't do it, others might. Richard Nixon went through a few, right? So that's what it would come down to, right?
Well, I assume he's smart enough to put someone in the office who he feels would feel those cases shouldn't go forward.
Interesting. Bill Barr, thank you very much. Always good seeing you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.